Alright, it's time for another update and forecast on the Caldor Fire. We were following this all last night, and this is the satellite imagery from yesterday evening where you can see that we had a very large increase in fire behavior. Actually, not only on the Caldor, but on the Dixie as well. There were some new evacuation orders on the Dixie fire, in addition to some of the new evacuation orders we've been seeing popping up on the Caldor Fire. So, because of that large increase in activity and some of the big stories that have been coming out of this area, what we're going to do throughout the course of this video is really focus on all the most important information since that large increase in activity yesterday. And then unfortunately, we're also going to be looking at the forecast for this afternoon, where it looks like it's going to be even more critical than yesterday, with very low relative humidity, some gusty southwesterly winds up to 35 miles per hour, and that red flag warning in place. But I think the top things that you need to know right now is that there's currently about 33,000 structures threatened on the Caldor Fire, and all of South Lake Tahoe is now under an evacuation order. But again, we're going to go over all the important updates throughout the course of this video, and especially take an in-depth look at where that fire perimeter is and how far it was able to extend as of yesterday. But just looking at the satellite imagery yesterday, you can see that we had a very active day. The big reason for that, this was when that wind event that we've been talking about for about a week now really started to come in. We saw those winds pick up, and unfortunately that led to a large amount of spot fires, which was able to lead to a large amount of growth. Now, if we want to see what the Caldor Fire and basically all the other fires in Northern California look like as of right now, you'll notice that there's more smoke coming off of them than we usually see in the morning hours. So that was kind of the in-between between where I left off last night in our update and forecast to where we are right now. Overnight, we were talking about how it was going to remain very dry through the overnight hours, relative humidity remaining in the 20s. So that allowed our fire behavior to continue into the overnight hours. And what that means is that even in the early morning, we're already seeing a large amount of fire activity. This is the Leak Springs camera. This is a time lapse over the last hour. And you can see that this already looks like what sometimes our fires look like in the afternoon hours. And again, the big reason for that was because we remained dry throughout the entire overnight hours and into right now. But the big story as we look into the future is going to be that red flag warning and the impact that it's going to have on the Caldor Fire. Unfortunately, we're going to have those same dry conditions that we've had the last 2 days that have led to that increase in fire behavior the last 2 days. But now we're also going to have even stronger winds than we've had in the past, which is the exact last thing that we'd want to hear. So just zooming in there, you can see where the Caldor Fire is, and you can see that it is entirely covered in that red flag warning. And I think key thing that I should point out here, I'm not going to spend too much time on this map because I have a new map now that shows a much more accurate depiction of where the fire actually is. Sometimes these hotspots can be off because it's basically picked up by satellites in space. So you imagine there's some margin for error when it comes to these, but I did just want to briefly show this to make two main points. One, if you look at the overall yellow shading right there, that's the overall fire perimeter for the Caldor Fire. And then where you see the red dots is where the majority of that recent activity has been. So you can see most of the recent activity has been on the northeastern section of the fire and this eastern section of the fire. And the main reason for that really just ties into the winds we've been talking about for about a week, and especially that wind event that we started to see yesterday afternoon with those strong southwesterly winds at about 25 to 35 miles per hour, causing that red flag warning, really pushing that fire to the northeast and to the east here as well. And as we'll see in a second, also leading to some spot fires. Now, the other reason I did want to show this map, even though the hotspots aren't 100% accurate here, is just, and that's actually a key thing to keep in mind as I'm about to show something, is where the structures are in this area, because I think this really paints the picture of why this is such a big story right now. And honestly, I would say the most critical situation that I've personally forecasted in the last 2 years of making these update and forecast videos on the California wildfires, and it's because you can see relatively where the fire is right now. Again, those hotspots aren't spot on, but then if you look at where these structures are, where it's shown with the orange dots, there's a few key areas of concern. One of the main spots that we were looking at a lot last night, and we're going to continue to look at throughout the day today, and especially into this evening, is Kirkwood right here. You can see how those hotspots have continued to get closer to that area where you see those orange dots, which represent the structures right there. And then as we move farther up to the northeast, closer to South Lake Tahoe, which you can see at the top of the screen, that was the big story that we were following last night, as some of those spot fires were able to develop in Christmas Valley and become established. But again, we'll actually switch to the other map right now because that kind of paints the picture. It looks like the fire completely went through that area, but as you'll see in a second, that luckily is not the entire story right there. This map that I'm about to show has a much more accurate depiction of where that fire perimeter actually is as of right now. So just getting our bearings, there's Lake Tahoe. That's what the Caldor Fire looked like on the 28th. So I did just want to go back in time for a second real quick so that we could see how this fire has progressed. So one thing to keep in mind, it's going to be a little confusing when I click on these dates here on the left side of the screen, because when I click on August 30th, that'll actually be showing a lot of the fire activity that we saw on the 29th. So just a little warning, that will be a little confusing, but I do want to just show this progression. So that's what we had as of the 27th, and then as we got into the 28th, and 28th was when we still didn't have all that much activity on the fires. It was still active, but that was when we had those weaker winds, that high pressure system was over us. We had that nice smoke inversion that was keeping the fire behavior and the temperatures down. Winds were relatively calm. At that point, between the 27th and the 28th, what the activity that burned on the 28th, we did continue to grow towards the northeast, maybe a half a mile. And if we look at the actual kind of map of the divisions and the containment lines, it's that black line right there that represents where they had those containment lines. They were working on these for a number of days because we saw that wind event coming in. So that was the key thing that we wanted to stop the fire, because again, that's where all the structures are up here to the northeast, and they knew those southwest winds were coming in. So the plan, as you could see those containment lines, was to be able to stop that fire in its tracks. But then basically what ended up happening was on the 29th, I'm even getting mixed up on my days here. On the 29th, that was when we had very dry conditions, and that smoke inversion started to clear, and you can see how the fire was able to jump over those containment lines. So I'll turn that map off so we can get a better view here. So this is what it looked like when we were getting into yesterday afternoon. As of this morning, just zooming out, you can see what the map looked like. We had seen a large amount of growth in those key areas to the northeast and the east of the fire. And then as we were following this last night, this is basically the updated maps. I'll turn these off so that they're not as distracting. So this is what we saw grow last night. And then right here, it also adds in even more of that growth that we saw even later into this morning, taking in some of that growth that we saw later this morning. So that paints the picture of what ended up happening yesterday. We had that fire pushing up towards Echo Lake as we were in this morning and early yesterday afternoon, and then it was those southwesterly winds that were able to push this fire, and in some cases it led to some spot fires over Christmas Valley right here. So now I'm just going to turn on the most recent perimeter so we can actually get a good look at what exactly happened here. So clicking right here first, I'm going to close that up for a second so we can see this a little bit better. One of the key things that we were following in last night's update and forecast, and apology if all those dates and the progression was a little tricky. Hopefully I'll make that a little bit smoother in future videos, but now this should be a lot more helpful as we actually start to zoom in here. the big story that we were following last night, I'll zoom out so we can get our bearings again. Caldor Fire right here, Lake Tahoe up here. The key spots again that we were looking at was this Kirkwood area. Throughout the day yesterday, we did see some spot fires jump over Highway 88 here, and you can see that the fire perimeter has crossed that area, but as of the most recent fire perimeter data, we're not picking up any new. It doesn't look like it's actually moved into Kirkwood yet, but again, I'm only as good as the most recent data, so I can't officially confirm that that is true as of right now. But where we were following the most last night was on this northeastern section. So looking up, you could see Lake Tahoe off in the distance. And then what we were following was we were actually watching this fire move closer towards Highway 50 here in Christmas Valley down here. And we actually watched it come down this hill, and then it led to a spot fire that jumped over Highway 50 right here. And then we also had a number of spot fires actually go all the way across Christmas Valley in that area. So I do just want to zoom in at this spot because this is something that we were actually watching in real time yesterday. You can imagine there's Highway 50. The fire was coming down this hill being pushed forward by those southwesterly winds, and then a spot fire, we watched it jump over Highway 50 and then start to become established on that left side or the right side of the road. So I just wanted to zoom in there because you can actually see that play out on this map. The flames on the left side of Highway 50, and then if you look up the hill, you can see that fire starting to creep down the hill. And then if you look on the right side of Highway 50, you can actually see that smoke coming up right there where that spot fire had become established. So just zooming back out and seeing where this fire went. So then over the next few hours, we're continuing to watch as those spot fires became even more developed in Christmas Valley and then even jumped to the eastern side right there. But the key thing that I want to point out here, and I should probably turn on the other more recent perimeter as I'm talking about this, is that when we look at where those structures are, you can see most of those structures are right. I'll turn off the fire activity so you can see better. Most of those structures are right in the center of the valley at the very lower elevations of it. And if we zoom in to this map, you can see that it looks like the fire almost jumped that area, and then fortunately it looks like it left a large amount of these structures untouched. So again, I can't confirm that. I'm only good as my most recent data, but from where we left off last night, I would say this is looking much, much better than what I was expecting to see this morning. What we were afraid was that those spot fires were actually becoming developed in the structures themselves, and then those southerly winds were just going to push the fire forward through this valley overnight. But as of right now, it looks like the majority of that fire perimeter remains on the sides of the valley wall, and a majority of those structures do remain untouched. But with that being said, we do have those critical conditions coming in later this afternoon. So we are going to have to keep a very close eye on this area because I do think it is going to be one of the critical areas to watch because you can see how much activity is in this area, how much of a run it started to make last night as we continued to have those southwesterly winds pushing that spot fire that had jumped over Christmas Valley further. But just zooming in there, you can see where a lot of those streets are, and for the most part, it looks like that fire perimeter stays outside of where we see a lot of those streets. So I would say as of right now, that's some relatively, it's bad news and good news. The bad news is that it jumped into Christmas Valley at all with those southwest winds carrying those spot fires. Good news is that the entire fire perimeter isn't completely in that area yet. So again, that was probably much longer and not as concise as I wanted it to be, but really just wanted to drive that point home because as of last night, the situation almost looked like the fire was completely established within a lot of those structures. But according to the most recent fire perimeter, sounds like our CAL FIRE resources were able to do a pretty amazing job keeping that out of the community itself. But again, that is something that we're going to have to follow as we move forward into this afternoon, because once again we have critical conditions coming in, which once again is just going to try to take this side of the fire and push it into the community. You can imagine those southwest winds will try to push it right there. And then we're also going to have some even more southerly winds tonight, which will try to take this part of the fire and move it up into places like Myers. So again, that is certainly going to be the top area that I'm following tonight, where so it's good news that it's not in this community as of right. Isn't fully established in this community as of right now, but I would say that this is still the most critical situation that I've personally forecasted for in the 2 years that I've been doing this, because that's where we have all this fire going on right now. And then as we get into tonight and into this afternoon, we're going to have those same challenging conditions we had yesterday, where those southwesterly winds are going to be trying to push this fire forward, possibly even leading to some new spot fires happening. So again, I think this is a very critical situation that we do have to continue to follow. As you can see how much it grew throughout the day yesterday, and unfortunately the fire weather conditions are looking even more critical this afternoon. But just looking at the most recent acreage burned, you can see that large increase in the overall acreage that we had yesterday. We're up to 191,000 acres. If you want to look at the overall progression of that, it started here where you see that green color, and then it has mostly grown to the northeast. That's mostly because we've had those southwesterly winds pushing this fire farther to the northeast. And then, I'm not sure what that happened. And then where you see that purple color is the most recent growth, with the key standouts being that area to the left of Kirkwood, where it jumped over Highway 88 yesterday, and then also the area where it jumped over Highway 50, where we actually tied it in with that video that we were looking at, and then those spot fires that also crossed Christmas Valley over Highway 89 as well. And overall, I think those will continue to be the two areas that we follow the closest over. As we get into tonight, I'm planning on doing another extended update and forecast tonight. We're going to keep a close eye on that Kirkwood area, but especially that whole Christmas Valley and Myers area. And then when it comes to the containment, you can see we actually did pick up some containment yesterday, which was a surprise, because I was thinking with how critical the situation was, they would only be able to think about structure protection and just getting any people that were still there just out into safety. But we were actually able to pick up a little containment yesterday, which again, I'd say it was a surprise just based on the critical situation that we were seeing. But looking at where that containment was picked up, it's on the left side mostly of the Caldor Fire and the southern side. So the red line shows where the fire is uncontained. The black line shows where the fire is contained. So we do still have some uncontained areas on the southern edge of that northwestern finger right there, and I know that has been a challenge for CAL FIRE as some spot fires keep going over those previous dozer lines, but hopefully we'll see that get wrapped up, as that hasn't been as active of a part of the fire as some of the other spots. Where we've seen the most activity is again on that area by Kirkwood and pushing into Christmas Valley, where unfortunately you can see the fire is uncontained, but no surprise there because that's all new growth based on what happened yesterday. Now, I probably should have shown this first in the video, but big story going on is that, and maybe the number one thing that I should say is that there is a large number of evacuation orders and warnings in place, more than I could possibly go into. So I will say for those, you can click the link in the description, go to CAL FIRE, INSUWEB, and Caldor Fire. But I will show the basic map of what the evacuation orders look like for the Caldor Fire. You can see all of South Lake Tahoe is in that red color, which represents mandatory evacuation orders. So that means that it's no longer time to pack up or do structure protection around your house. If you have that red color, that means now is the time to get out. And you can see why they issued that, and it really is good that they issued that when they did, because you can see all that growth we had yesterday. We saw the fire push into Christmas Valley, and then as we get into tonight, we're going to continue to have those southwesterly winds trying to push that fire farther towards South Lake Tahoe. And unfortunately, one thing that we were talking about yesterday as well is if we zoom in to where we see this fire, one unfortunate aspect is that in a valley like this, not sure why it just zoomed out like that. So in a valley like this, you can see just based, it's because I was pressing the wrong button. Sorry about that. So what I'm trying to say is that in Christmas Valley right here, where you see the fire is becoming established, the winds are going to be stronger than in other places. The reason for that, I always think of this like if you're spraying water out of a hose and you put your thumb over the end of the hose, the water starts to come out a lot faster. Well, the same thing happens to those southwesterly and even more southerly winds that we're going to have this afternoon. It almost gets pinched through this valley, through that topography, and then it speeds up. So that, again, is one of the challenging things that we see when it comes to the direction that the winds are going this afternoon and also where that fire is currently established. So just going back here, that makes sense why all of South Lake Tahoe is under that mandatory evacuation order. If you are still in that area, I would definitely get out right now because looks like there's a lot of fire established and we have very critical conditions with those winds that will try to push that fire further into Christmas Valley and into South Lake Tahoe as well. Now, we haven't seen a big update on the structures destroyed as of this point. Looks like it's 669 structures destroyed. I believe the reason for that is we haven't had the damage assessment teams actually go through the more northeastern parts of this fire, the parts that have burned more recently. But I imagine as those damage assessment teams start to come back, we will likely see that structures destroyed number go up. Now, also when it comes to the structures, I think that's a key thing to point out there. You can see that 33,000 structures are currently threatened as of right now. And that really kind of drives home the point of why this is such a critical situation. And you can also see that there's been 5 injuries on this fire. So hopefully all the people that were injured can recover. And then as always, thoughts and prayers go out to everybody who has been affected by this fire, whether you've only evacuated at this point or if you have been one of the people notified where your structure was destroyed. And God, I almost am hesitant to show the fire weather forecast coming up because it just looks like the weather is not going to be giving us any break. Usually we'll maybe have 1 or 2 really bad days and then the weather kind of calms down a little bit, but again, it actually almost looks like it's picking up this afternoon. But before we get to that, I will focus on maybe some of the good news. Good news is we still have a massive amount of resources, and actually even more than the last time we looked at this. 25 helicopters, 415 engines. You can see almost 4,000 personnel at this point. And key thing that I want to zero in on here is what an amazing job that all the wildland firefighters do. So thinking about this, it's no coincidence that fire didn't just rip through the entire Christmas Valley right here. You can imagine they had a large amount of resources in this area doing structure protection, working as hard as they possibly could to keep that fire perimeter almost right along and outside of where you see those streets. So really amazing job done by our firefighters, and I'd say that is the good news going forward is we have basically an army on this fire that is completely focused, working around the clock in some cases to protect our structures and our lives as well. So big thank you to all the wildland firefighters out there. Now, with that note of good news, I think it is time to get into the bad news as we get into this afternoon's fire weather forecast. The big transition that we've seen, we tried to look at the fire progression on this map. It didn't go all too well, so I think it's better to maybe just look at it again on this map right here because it shows exactly why winds are so important. It started down here and we've had mostly southwesterly winds, and you can see most of that growth has been towards the northeast. And then also the other point I was making was when we had those calmer winds that was when it was just maybe growing a half a mile a day right here. And then as the wind started to pick up, as our relative humidity dropped down, that's when we started to see these large increases on the northeastern and eastern sections of this fire. So keep that in mind as we're looking at the weather forecast. When we had those calmer conditions, it was when we had just a big high pressure system over us. But what's been leading to that increase in activity the last 2 days was this trough starting to build into the Pacific Northwest. You see that cold air mass up there, and you'd think that would be good news because you'd think that would bring some nice cooler conditions in. And in some cases, it did cool the temperatures down a little bit, but we still have extremely dry air, and what it also did was bring some gustier winds in. Key thing, whenever you're looking at this map, if you see those lines very far apart, that's where you have very weak winds, and then you can see as this trough builds into Northern California, it brings those tighter isobars into Northern California, which means gustier winds as well. So as of right now, it looks like we already have some 25 mile per winds, and I just want to make sure we're looking at a good spot here. So let's zoom in. And so there's Lower Echo Lake right there. Let's click right on Myers and use that as our spot as we look at the forecast, because I think that's probably one of the areas I'm the most concerned about today, because that's where you'll see that the wind and the fire aligns. So one thing I will point out, it's 8 in the morning and we're already seeing some 25 mile per hour wind gusts there, but even more importantly, our relative humidity is already in the 20s. And that was the big story last night, and why that fire was able to continue last night is because our relative humidity never increased all that much. That's why the fire was able to remain active and continue to grow during the overnight hours. And that's bad news for today, because we're already starting at a very low baseline when it comes to relative humidity. Now as we get into 11 a.m. and into 2 p.m. and into 5 p.m., you can see relative humidity is about as critical as we're ever going to see it, in the low teens to even single digits in some places. So that's the same kind of dry air that we've had the last 2 days that has led to such an increase in activity. But even more critically is when we look at the winds, they're going to be, or at least they're forecasted to be, even stronger than they were yesterday. And the reason that's so important, you notice what direction they're coming from the southwest. If we match that up with the fire perimeter that we've been talking about for this entire time, it's those southwesterly winds that are going to try to push that fire farther towards the northeast. So again, key spots that we'll be following is the Kirkwood area, as those winds try to push that hot spot closer towards Kirkwood, and then also this area around Christmas Valley as well. But as we were seeing yesterday, I think the number one thing that strong winds bring to a fire, and I would say almost the number one factor that leads to the rapid growth that we've seen not only on this fire but on the Dixie Fire as well, are those strong winds causing spot fires. Because I believe at one point they were hoping to use Highway 50 here as some kind of line to be able to stop the fire, and as we saw in the past on the Caldor Fire, they had those containment lines in place. But what ends up happening when you get those strong winds is it doesn't really matter what containment lines you have, because it just picks up burning embers. In this case, it tossed the embers all the way across the valley, starts a new spot fire over there, and now it's a whole new situation to try to adjust to and evolve the strategies for stopping this fire. So it can take days of progress building a containment line like we were seeing on that one section down here, and then all it takes is one burning ember dropped into those critically dry fuels where there's about a 90 to 100% chance of ignition of that burning ember to develop a spot fire and then lead to growth like we saw last night as those spot fires dropped into Christmas Valley on both sides right here. So that, again, I think is the big reason winds are so important. Whatever direction the winds are blowing is most likely the direction the fire is going to be moving. And the faster the winds are, the faster the fire is going to move, and the more likely those spot fires become, and the farther away those spot fires can develop. So just looking at the overall forecast for this afternoon, again, it looks critical. We have even stronger winds than yesterday. Temperatures are relatively warm, but then relative humidity is in the low teens to single digits. So Unfortunately, going to be a very critical day on the Caldor Fire once again. To basically summarize that fire weather forecast, you can see there's the potential for easier fire starts, potential for rapid spread of new and existing fires. It's through Wednesday evening, so I didn't even show Wednesday's forecast yet because we have enough to think about right now, and I'm planning on doing another one of these update videos tomorrow morning where we'll focus on Wednesday. We'll just take it one day at a time right now, but right there summarizes it. 20 to 35 mile per hour winds, relative humidity as low as the single digits right there. But I do actually want to look at the winds tonight real quick because that plays an important role as we move forward. You can imagine right there is where we have some of that fire developing. As we get into the overnight hours, we saw this last night, the winds turn to a much more southerly direction, almost going directly towards South Lake Tahoe. So that'll be something to think about as you get into later tonight. The winds seem to shift more southerly, which again would be a concern for this area because that would be funneling the winds straight through where we have the largest amount of structures. So I think that's a big thing to keep our eye on. But overall, red flag warning until 11 p.m. Wednesday. So that will be a key thing that we continue to watch moving forward. Then I almost didn't show this today because I looked at it and it shows a very large amount of fire growth, but it also showed a very large amount of fire growth yesterday, and I was almost hesitant to show it yesterday for that reason. And then we ended up seeing pretty much exactly what the model was forecasting. So again, when it comes to this model, this is the WRF S-Fire wildfire simulation model. We run this out of the San Jose State Fire Weather Research Laboratory. I might be a little biased saying this, but it is one of the top wildfire models in the entire world. It combines the fire perimeter and those active hotspots with the fuel, weather, topography variables. And then what sets this model apart from others is that it does a really good job of simulating how the wildfire is going to create its own weather, and then how that weather is then going to affect the wildfire. And that's something that we've seen play a very big role in the Caldor Fire, where you get those huge smoke plumes with all that rising air. We've actually seen on some of the videos where you get some gusty, erratic winds coming in to fill that spot where a lot of that air has just risen. Now, before I show this, again, the main thing that I want to emphasize is this is an experimental forecast only. So this isn't showing exactly what's going to happen. It's just as far as the science has moved as of right now. And the other thing that I want to say is it doesn't take into account fire suppression tactics. And on the fire yesterday, you can see how important that actually does come into play. And the fact that we have about 4,000 personnel in this fire. And as you can see, they have the amazing ability to do what would seem to be almost unimaginable. When we were seeing those videos last night of how extreme that fire behavior looked in Christmas Valley, the fact that they were able to keep it out of a lot of these structures was absolutely amazing. So keep that in mind as I'm about to press the play button here. But again, main reason I show this is because it does often show the overall general areas of where we will be seeing growth, and it's also the best animation that we have to tie in the main theme of this video, where I've been trying to drive the point home that it's where those winds and the fire align that you get the fire growth, and that is why that red flag warning combined with where we have those structures is so critical. So just pressing play here, you can see the clock on the bottom. This is now still simulating what happened last night into early this morning. Right there's the area around Kirkwood. That's the area around Christmas Valley. Not focusing as much on the left side of the screen because that's where the fire is basically contained at this point. So this, right now it's about 10 a.m. today, 12 then into 1 p.m. You can see it forecast those winds picking up. You notice those vectors get a bit larger, and then right when those winds pick up, you start to see that fire activity increase on the northern and northeastern sides of the fire where it's aligned with the fire. And then I'll just go back to about 6 o'clock because right here the winds are still very southwest. It's pushing that fire even more into Christmas Valley, but then the winds shift more to the south. That's what we were talking about earlier, where during the overnight hours it almost points directly towards South Lake Tahoe. So the reason I emphasized that was because that would try to push the fire more directly north, which is the exact opposite thing we'd want to see, as that would be towards where we have a very large amount of structures. And then as we get into tomorrow afternoon, that's when there is another red flag warning in place, and you can see that once again it had more and more growth towards the northeast where the fire and the winds align. So again, just an experimental forecast, but it is good to look at this because it's a perfect illustration of where those winds come up, where it's picking up this afternoon, getting those red flag conditions where it's low relative humidity and the gusty winds up to 25 to 35 miles per hour. That's where you start to see the fire continue to push farther towards the northeast. So just zooming out again, you can watch that southerly wind event come in, and then it starts to push the fire up towards Lake Tahoe Airport. As of right now, it shows that it would be over Myers, but I'm actually going to stop playing that because, again, I don't actually expect it, or at least I'm always an optimist, so I don't expect it to be that bad because we have about 4,000 personnel on this, and they do some amazing work. We've seen them do some amazing things throughout the season. Just to drive that point home, I will show one spot that I think perfectly proves this point. Well, one thing that proves this point is the fact that it didn't just go through all of Christmas Valley yesterday. That seemed like for the most part they were able to keep it out of a lot of those structures, but I think another perfect example is Chester on the Dixie Fire, where this was one of those areas where it looked about as critical as a fire possibly could look, and we did have some structures destroyed in this area, but for the most part they basically stopped the fire in its tracks and protected thousands of structures in here. So that's what I'm certainly hoping for later today, that things won't be as bad as it seems like they're going to be as of right now, because as of right now pretty much every factor is aligning against us just based on where the fire currently is, where we have the largest amount of structures right now in Kirkwood and the Christmas Valley, Myers area, and then also what the winds are going to be doing later this afternoon. The winds picking up to about 35 miles per hour in the strongest places, moving directly towards the northeast, which is the exact direction we wouldn't want it to be burning. So again, as I said, I think this is the most critical situation that I've personally forecasted for. So I will be back tonight, just like we did last night. We're going to follow the fire in real time. We're going to try to pick up where spot fires are happening, try to get an idea of where the fire perimeter has extended to. So if you want to stay tuned for that, you can subscribe to my channel. You can also follow me on Twitter, where this was actually one of the things that made yesterday's update and forecast video so helpful, was people were actually sending in videos and recommendations of different cameras to look at. So what I was able to do in last night's update forecast video is see exactly where this was. There'd be in some cases an address, show what highway we're looking at, and then we're able to actually go into Google Earth and see, okay, so here's where the fire perimeter previously was. Now it looks like, based on that video, it's jumped over Highway 50. And I will certainly do that again tonight, because it was certainly a good way to follow the fire, using the combination of some of the resources I have at my disposal, and then all of you guys on the ground sending in the great videos and recommendations and information, so we could pool it all together to try to get the most important information out there. But when it comes to the most important information, I would say this is it. There's mandatory evacuation orders for all of South Lake Tahoe, and the forecast for this afternoon looks even more critical than yesterday. So if you are, for whatever reason, still in this area, I would 100% get out as of right now, because we're already seeing a fair bit of fire activity this morning, and it's only just going to pick up throughout the day today. But again, I will be here following this fire. I plan on going live at about 4:30, but you can also click the notification bell to get notified the second that I do go live. So sorry that this video that was supposed to be concise ended up not being concise at all. And also apologies for the fire progression on Google Earth getting a little confusing here. That was the first time that I've tried to do that, so guaranteed tomorrow will be better and tomorrow morning's more concise update and forecast. But with all that being said, I will be back this evening. Huge thank you to all the wildland firefighters out there who are quite possibly doing the hardest job on earth. And then also thoughts and prayers go out to everybody who has been affected by these wildfires. I hope this video was helpful, and I'll see you all later this evening.